In the silence between us. Chapter 1. A chance meeting. It was a bright autumn morning, the kind of day when the air felt crisp and fresh, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves. Lillian stood on the corner of a busy street, waiting for the pedestrian light to change. Her fingers absent-mindedly tightened the scarf around her neck, warding off the chill that clung to the city this time of year. She had always loved autumn, the way the trees turned into shades of gold and amber, the ground littered with rustling leaves that crunched beneath her boots. This was her favorite time to be out in the world, walking without a set destination, letting her thoughts wander as aimlessly as her feet. Across the street, Alex leaned against a lamppost, staring into the distance, though his thoughts were far from where his eyes rested. The day felt ordinary to him, just another in the blur of routine. He had always been more drawn to summer, where the warmth lingered long into the night and everything seemed alive and carefree. But now, standing in the growing cold, he found himself adjusting his coat, resisting the change that nature had thrust upon him. His mind was preoccupied with the many small worries of daily life: work deadlines, family expectations, his uncertainty about the future. He barely noticed the world around him. The light changed, and the flow of pedestrians surged forward. Lillian stepped into the crowd, her eyes drifting upward to take in the expanse of blue sky peeking between the tall buildings that lined the street. She was caught up in the serenity of the moment, hardly paying attention to the people passing by, until something unusual happened. It was a moment so small, so brief, that it could have gone unnoticed, but it didn't. As she passed by the lamppost, her shoulder brushed lightly against Alex's. That fleeting touch sent a jolt through her, pulling her attention sharply to the present. Alex, too, felt it. The contact, though minor, stirred something deep inside him. He turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the woman who had just passed. She was already a few steps ahead, her hair bouncing lightly with each stride, her figure blending into the crowd. For a second, he thought about calling out to her, but what would he say? There was no reason to speak, no logical explanation for the sudden awareness he felt. Still, something tugged at him, urging him to turn and follow her with his eyes, perhaps with his heart. Lillian felt it, too, that strange and unexplainable tug. She slowed her pace, her thoughts now a tangle of curiosity and uncertainty. She didn't look back, though something in her urged her to. She kept walking, her steps slower now, more deliberate. Her mind raced ahead, trying to make sense of the odd sensation that lingered from that brief touch. Was it just a random moment in a sea of random moments? Or was there something more? She had no answer, only the lingering echo of that instant. The city around them buzzed with life. Cars honked in the distance, the hum of conversations filled the air, and the constant rhythm of footsteps pounded the pavement like a heartbeat. Neither of them moved with purpose anymore. They were simply walking, adrift in the same ocean of people, yet somehow more aware of each other's presence than anyone else around them. Lillian stopped at a small park just ahead. The trees, their leaves turning shades of gold, provided a canopy of color that filtered the sunlight, casting a soft glow over everything. She took a seat on one of the benches, her eyes following the path of a single leaf as it swirled and danced on the breeze before coming to rest gently on the ground. She allowed herself a moment of stillness, a moment to breathe and collect her thoughts. A few minutes later, Alex found himself at the entrance of the same park. He hadn't planned to come here, but his feet seemed to have led him to this spot without his mind's permission. He paused at the gate, taking in the peaceful scene before him. His eyes scanned the area, and there she was, sitting on a bench, her face turned toward the trees, completely unaware of his presence. He hesitated for a moment. Should he approach? Should he leave? It was strange, the pull he felt toward her, a stranger whose name he didn't even know. But something about her felt familiar, as if they had shared more than just a brief moment on a crowded street. He took a deep breath and walked into the park, moving slowly, as if not to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. Lillian, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself relax into the comfort of the day. When she opened them again, she noticed a figure approaching in the distance. It was the same man from earlier, the one she had brushed past on the street. He was walking in her direction, though there was no indication that he had any particular purpose for being there. She watched him for a moment, her curiosity piqued once more. Alex walked past her bench, his gaze forward, but not entirely unaware of her presence. He didn't stop or slow down, but the proximity was enough to stir something within both of them. As he passed, the moment hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that their paths had crossed not once, but twice in the span of a few minutes. It was as if the universe had nudged them together, though neither of them understood why. He continued walking, disappearing down the path and out of sight. Lillian remained on the bench, her thoughts chasing after him even though her body remained still. She didn't know what it all meant, if it meant anything at all. But for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, even if it was too soon to understand what. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Lillian rose from the bench and continued on her way. Alex, too, found his way out of the park, his mind heavy with thoughts he couldn't quite grasp. Neither of them looked back, but they both carried the memory of that chance meeting with them as they left the park behind. Chapter 2. Silent Glances. The next morning unfolded in much the same way as before. Autumn light filtering through half-open curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. Lillian stood by her window, sipping her coffee, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines of the street below. Cars drifted by in steady intervals, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk, and the city continued its quiet hum, as if unaware of the changes taking root within her. Her mind drifted back to the previous day, to that fleeting encounter on the busy street and later in the park. She couldn't explain why it lingered with her, why her thoughts circled back to him, a stranger she hadn't spoken to, someone she knew nothing about. Yet there was something undeniable in the memory, a subtle pull, like a thread connecting them in ways she couldn't quite define. Lillian shook her head, setting her coffee cup down and grabbing her coat. She had errands to run, things to do, and losing herself in idle thoughts of a chance encounter wasn't practical. Yet as she stepped out into the brisk morning air, she couldn't help but glance down the street, wondering, just for a moment, if she might see him again. Across the city, Alex sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on his keyboard. The morning was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the hum of the office around him. He should have been focused, but his mind wandered in the gaps between emails and tasks. He found himself staring out of the window more than once, his thoughts returning to the woman from yesterday. The image of her, walking past him, sitting on the park bench, the way she seemed lost in thought, played in his mind like a half-remembered dream. He hadn't said a word to her, and yet she occupied his thoughts as though they'd shared something profound. It was strange. Alex wasn't the type to dwell on such things, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That chance meeting, brief as it was, had stirred something deep within him, something that made the familiar rhythms of his life seem less certain, less predictable. Later that afternoon, Lillian found herself strolling through the same park where they had crossed paths the day before. She wasn't entirely sure why she had come back. She told herself it was simply to enjoy the crisp autumn air, to soak in the beauty of the golden leaves, but deep down, she knew better. Her eyes scanned the park, taking in the familiar scene, the benches, the towering trees, the paths that wound through the greenery. A part of her hoped, though she wouldn't admit it, that he might be there again, walking the same path. As the hours passed and the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park, Alex found himself drawn to the same spot. His day had passed in a blur of meetings and deadlines, but none of it felt real, not in the way that brief encounter had felt real. He wasn't sure what he expected to find there, but the pull was undeniable, a quiet insistence that brought him back to the place where their paths had crossed. He entered the park, his steps slower this time, more deliberate. His eyes swept over the landscape, taking in the soft hues of autumn, the way the light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. He didn't see her at first, and for a moment, he wondered if perhaps it had all been in his head, if the connection he felt was nothing more than a fleeting fantasy. But then, as he rounded the bend in the path, there she was. Lillian stood near the edge of the pond, her back to him, watching the gentle ripples in the water as the wind sent tiny waves across the surface. She looked peaceful, her posture relaxed, her attention seemingly lost in the serenity of the moment. Alex stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do next. He hadn't planned on approaching her, hadn't even expected to see her again. But now that she was there, just a few steps away, he couldn't deny the pull that urged him to get closer. Lillian, unaware of his presence, remained still, lost in her own thoughts. She watched as a flock of birds took flight, their wings beating softly against the autumn sky. There was a calmness to the scene, a sense of quiet that soothed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Yet beneath that calm, a restlessness lingered, a curiosity, a yearning she couldn't quite name. She felt it like an echo, something unfinished from the day before, a connection that lingered in the corners of her mind. Alex took a step forward, and then another. He didn't want to disturb her, didn't want to intrude on her quiet moment of peace, but something inside him urged him closer, as if the universe had conspired to bring them back together. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she might sense his presence, though he remained silent, unsure of how to proceed. And then, almost as if she had sensed him, Lillian turned. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, time seemed to still. There was no need for words, no need for explanation. The recognition between them was immediate, like a continuation of something that had begun the day before. It was as if they both understood, on some unspoken level, that this was not merely coincidence, but something more. Their gazes held, the quiet intensity of the moment stretching between them like a thread that refused to break. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words, no need for anything beyond the silent connection that passed between them. After what felt like an eternity, Lillian turned back to the pond, her heart beating faster, though her outward demeanor remained composed. She didn't need to look again to know that he was still there, watching her from a distance. And Alex, too, remained rooted to the spot, his heart echoing the same quiet rhythm. He didn't know what the next step was, didn't know if there even was a next step, but for now, this was enough. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue over the park, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze was the only sound that filled the space between them. For now, the silence was enough. It spoke of possibilities, of things yet to come. And though neither of them knew what the future held, they both sensed that this was only the beginning. As the evening light faded and the park began to empty, Lillian finally turned to leave. Her steps were slow, measured, as if she was reluctant to break the spell that had been cast over the day. She didn't look back, though she could feel his gaze lingering on her as she walked away. Alex watched her go, a quiet certainty settling over him. He didn't follow her, didn't try to catch up. Instead, he let her slip away into the fading light, knowing somehow that their paths would cross again. It was not the end, but merely the continuation of something deeper, something silent, something waiting to unfold. And in that silence, the promise of something more lingered. Chapter 3. A Shared Moment. The days that followed passed in a blur of routine for both Lillian and Alex. The city continued its familiar rhythm, the world around them unchanged, yet something inside them felt different. There was a quiet hum beneath the surface of their lives now, an invisible thread of anticipation that neither could fully explain. They went about their days, work, errands, the usual busyness of life. But in the quiet moments, when their minds were allowed to wander, they found themselves thinking of the other. Lillian, in particular, felt the change more deeply. She had always been content in her own company, finding solace in the simple pleasures of her solitary routines. But now, as she walked through the streets she had always known, there was a sense of something missing, or rather, a sense of something that had been added. A subtle layer of yearning that pulled her thoughts back to the park, to the man whose gaze had lingered on her that day. She returned to the park more often now, her walks taking her down familiar paths, past the same benches and trees that had witnessed their silent connection. Each time, her eyes searched the faces of the strangers around her, hoping, perhaps without fully admitting it to herself, that she might see him again. But days passed, and he didn't appear. The world continued on its way, the leaves slowly falling from the trees, carpeting the ground in shades of gold and amber. Yet despite his absence, Lillian felt his presence, a quiet echo that seemed to linger in the spaces around her. It was in the way the wind rustled through the trees, in the way the light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the path ahead of her. It was as though the park itself held a memory of that brief encounter, and each time she returned, she found herself drawn deeper into that unspoken connection. Alex, too, felt the weight of the days as they passed. His life, once filled with the comfortable monotony of work and obligations, now felt slightly out of balance. There was a restlessness in him that he couldn't quite place, a sense that something important had slipped through his fingers and was waiting just out of reach. He thought of her often, the woman from the park, her quiet presence lingering in his mind like a half-forgotten dream. He didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her life, and yet he felt as though they were connected in ways he couldn't fully understand. On the 5th day after their last encounter, Alex found himself walking through the park once again. He hadn't planned to go. In fact, he had set out to run errands, his mind preoccupied with the usual to-do list. But as he passed the familiar gate, something urged him to step inside. The air was cooler now, the signs of winter slowly approaching, but the park still held its autumn beauty. He wandered along the path, his thoughts drifting, until he came to the clearing by the pond. And there she was. Lillian stood by the water's edge, her gaze focused on the still surface of the pond, where the faintest ripple disturbed the glassy reflection of the trees. She looked peaceful, lost in her own world, yet somehow, Alex knew she was aware of his presence. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to approach, unsure of what this moment meant, but then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he stepped forward. The crunch of leaves beneath his boots was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to draw her attention. Lillian turned, her eyes meeting his, and once again, the world seemed to pause. There was no surprise in her gaze, no startlement at seeing him again. Instead, there was a quiet recognition, as though she had been expecting him all along. Alex stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to do next. But there was no need for action, no need for words. In that moment, their connection was stronger than it had ever been. The silence between them was not empty, but full of the unspoken understanding that had been building since their first encounter. Lillian turned back to the pond, her hands resting lightly at her sides. She didn't need to speak or gesture for him to join her. The invitation was in the air, in the way she stood there, waiting without expectation. Alex moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate, until he stood beside her. Together, they gazed out at the water, the stillness of the pond mirroring the stillness between them. The minutes passed, and neither of them moved. The air around them was filled with the soft sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the gentle whisper of the wind. It was peaceful, yet charged with an undercurrent of something more. Alex felt it in the way his heart beat slightly faster, in the way his thoughts quieted in her presence. There was no need to fill the silence, no need to break the spell of the moment. They stood side by side, their gazes fixed on the same point, their thoughts unknowingly aligned. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park, Lillian finally stirred. She glanced over at Alex, her eyes soft, her expression unreadable yet filled with a quiet sense of peace. She didn't smile, but there was a warmth in her gaze that spoke volumes. Alex returned her look, his own thoughts mirrored in hers. They didn't need to say anything. The connection between them was clear, as if they had both known, even before this moment, that they would find each other again. Without a word, Lillian took a step forward, her gaze shifting to the path that wound through the park. She didn't look back, but Alex understood. He followed her, his steps falling in sync with hers, and together they began to walk. The path ahead of them was bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon, the trees arching over them like a canopy. Their steps were slow, unhurried, as if the moment itself held all the time in the world. They walked in silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they meandered through the park. The connection between them, unspoken yet undeniable, seemed to grow with each step. It was a quiet intimacy, born not of words or gestures, but of a shared understanding that neither of them fully grasped, yet both accepted without question. They didn't need to speak to know that this was something special, something rare. As they reached the edge of the park, where the path met the city streets once more, they paused. The world outside the park seemed distant, as though it belonged to another reality, one that was separate from the quiet world they had just shared. Lillian glanced at Alex, her eyes meeting his for a final, lingering moment. There was no need for goodbye, no need for anything more. They both knew that this wasn't the end. Lillian turned, her steps carrying her away from the park and into the busy streets. Alex watched her go, his heart filled with a quiet certainty that he couldn't explain. He didn't follow, didn't call out. He simply stood there, letting her slip into the crowd, knowing that this was only the beginning of something deeper. As the sun set and the sky turned to shades of pink and orange, Alex lingered for a moment longer, his thoughts filled with the quiet promise of what was to come. And though the world around him continued its busy hum, he knew that the shared moment they had experienced was far from over. They would meet again. Of that, he was certain. Chapter 4. Subtle Changes. Lillian awoke the next morning with a strange sense of calm, as though something inside her had shifted ever so slightly, yet deeply enough to be felt. The memory of yesterday lingered in her mind like a soft breeze, touching every thought and action with a quiet serenity. She couldn't explain it. How the simple act of walking through the park, side by side with a man she had never spoken to, had left such an indelible mark on her heart. It was as if the world had whispered to her in that moment, telling her that life was changing, even if she didn't fully understand how. She spent her morning in her usual routine, the comforting rituals of breakfast and a cup of coffee by the window, but there was a lightness in her today. Her thoughts drifted back to the park, to the quiet afternoon she had shared with him. Though they hadn't exchanged a single word, it felt as though they had spoken volumes. Every glance, every step, every breath had been a kind of communication, silent but profound. She wondered if he felt the same, if he, too, had walked away from that moment knowing something had begun. As the morning sunlight filtered through her apartment, Lillian decided to go back to the park. She didn't tell herself she was going there to see him. No, that would be too much to admit, even to herself. But she felt a pull toward that space, toward the trees and the pond, the peaceful paths winding through the heart of the city. Perhaps she hoped, on some level, that he might be there again, but she refused to let the hope grow too large, lest it overwhelm her. She dressed quickly, pulling on a light jacket to ward off the autumn chill, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The city bustled around her, people moving with purpose, cars rushing by, the endless hum of urban life. But Lillian felt removed from it all, as though she were walking through the motions of her day while something deeper called to her from just beyond the surface. As she neared the park, her heart began to beat a little faster. She told herself it was because of the crisp air, the invigorating energy of her morning walk, but deep down, she knew better. The possibility of seeing him again, of experiencing that same quiet connection, filled her with both anticipation and a strange kind of fear. What would she do if she saw him? What if he wasn't there? Or worse, what if he was, and the magic of yesterday was gone? But as she passed through the familiar gates, all her worries seemed to melt away. The park was just as she remembered it, the trees standing tall, their leaves glowing golden in the early light, the soft murmur of the city fading into the background as nature enveloped her. She breathed deeply, taking in the fresh scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, and allowed herself to relax into the quiet beauty of the morning. Lillian wandered through the park, her steps unhurried, her mind drifting in and out of her thoughts. She didn't rush to the pond, didn't seek out the exact place where they had stood the day before. Instead, she let the moment guide her, trusting that whatever was meant to happen would unfold naturally. Meanwhile, across the city, Alex stood at his window, his gaze fixed on the distant skyline. His morning had been much the same as every other day. Work, meetings, the usual grind that filled his hours. But something felt different. He had felt it from the moment he woke up, a subtle shift inside him that he couldn't quite place. His thoughts kept circling back to her, to the woman from the park. He didn't know why he was so drawn to her, why the memory of their quiet walk together lingered with him so strongly. But there it was, pulling at him with every passing moment. He debated whether or not to return to the park. Part of him resisted the idea. After all, what were the chances that she would be there again? And even if she was, what then? But another part of him, the part that had felt the connection between them so clearly, urged him to go. It was as if something beyond his control was guiding him back to her, back to the place where their paths had crossed. After a few minutes of indecision, Alex grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The air was cool against his skin as he made his way through the busy streets, the city unfolding around him in its usual chaotic fashion. But like Lillian, he felt apart from it all, as though the world around him was simply background noise, while something far more important waited for him in the quiet space of the park. When he arrived, the familiar sense of calm washed over him. The park was quieter than usual, with only a few scattered joggers and dog walkers moving through the trees. Alex walked slowly, his eyes scanning the landscape, though he tried not to seem as though he were searching for something or someone. He didn't want to admit, even to himself, that he was hoping to see her again. But with every step, his heart beat a little faster, the quiet anticipation building inside him. As he approached the pond, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing by the water's edge, was Lillian. She stood in almost the exact same spot where they had parted ways the day before, her gaze fixed on the rippling surface of the water, her posture relaxed, as if she belonged there. Alex stopped for a moment, simply watching her from a distance. She hadn't seen him yet, and he wasn't sure if he should approach. But something in the air, something in the stillness between them, urged him forward. He walked slowly, his footsteps soft on the gravel path, and as he drew closer, Lillian turned. Their eyes met, and once again, that unspoken understanding passed between them. There was no surprise in her gaze, no hesitation. It was as if she had known all along that he would come, as if they had both been drawn to this place by the same invisible force. Lillian smiled softly, though the smile didn't quite reach her lips. It was more a gentle shift in her expression, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence. Alex felt a warmth spread through him at the sight, though he didn't return the smile. Instead, he simply stood beside her, his eyes following hers to the water, where a few ducks paddled lazily across the surface. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar, as though they had shared it many times before. There was no need for words, no need to explain why they had both returned to this place. It was enough to simply be there, together, standing side by side in the stillness of the park. For a long time, they remained like that, watching the water, the birds, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The world around them faded into the background, and all that remained was the quiet connection between them. A bond that seemed to grow stronger with every shared moment, every breath. Eventually, Lillian moved, stepping away from the pond and back toward the path. She didn't look at him, didn't gesture for him to follow, but Alex understood. He fell into step beside her, their footsteps falling into the same quiet rhythm as before. They walked in silence, their paths weaving through the park in a meandering, unhurried way. Neither of them seemed to be in any rush to leave, to return to the outside world. It was as if they had found a sanctuary in this place, a space where time slowed and the rest of the world ceased to matter. Together, they moved through the trees, their steps light, their presence unobtrusive, as though they were part of the landscape itself. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the path, Lillian and Alex reached the edge of the park once more. They paused, standing at the gate, the city bustling just beyond. The quiet sanctuary of the park lay behind them, but neither of them seemed eager to leave it. Lillian turned to him, her eyes meeting his for a long, lingering moment. There was no need for words, no need for explanation. The connection between them was clear, and though they had not spoken a single word, both of them knew that this was only the beginning. Without a word, Lillian turned and walked away, her steps light and confident. Alex watched her go, the quiet certainty in his heart growing stronger with each passing second. He didn't follow her, didn't try to stop her. He knew, as surely as he knew the sun would rise the next day, that they would meet again. And in the fading light of the autumn evening, Alex stood for a moment longer, the world around him falling away as he was left with the quiet promise of what was to come. Chapter 5. The Unfolding Quiet. Days passed, marked by the slow transition of autumn into early winter. The city grew colder. The leaves that once filled the park with golden hues now crunched underfoot in dry, brittle layers. The air was crisp, biting at Lillian's cheeks and turning her breath into faint clouds of vapor as she walked. Despite the chill, she continued her now regular routine of visiting the park. It had become a quiet ritual for her, a part of her day that she looked forward to with an anticipation she couldn't quite explain. Her life outside the park was still much the same. She went to work, returned to her apartment, and filled her time with the familiar activities that had always brought her comfort. But now, there was a subtle undercurrent in everything she did, a quiet excitement that hummed beneath the surface of her day-to-day life. The memory of those silent moments with Alex lingered in her thoughts, shaping the way she moved through the world. Each time she returned to the park, a part of her hoped she might see him again. She didn't dwell on the thought, didn't let it consume her. But the hope was always there, soft and persistent, like the warmth of a barely lit fire in the back of her mind. When she arrived at the park gates each day, her eyes would instinctively scan the paths, searching for that familiar figure. More often than not, she was greeted only by the quiet landscape, the trees standing bare against the sky and the pond reflecting the pale winter light. But even in his absence, Lillian felt his presence. It was as though the park itself held a memory of him, of them. The bench where they had sat, the pond where they had stood together, the winding paths where their footsteps had once fallen in sync. All of it was imbued with the quiet echo of their connection, and even when she walked alone, she felt as though she wasn't truly by herself. It was on one of these quiet afternoons that she found him again. The day had been colder than usual, a sharp wind cutting through the city streets and driving most people indoors. Lillian had hesitated before leaving her apartment, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck and debating whether or not to venture out into the biting cold. But something inside her urged her forward, pulling her back to the park with a quiet insistence. She couldn't ignore it. She arrived at the park later than usual, the sun already beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The air was cold and still, the last remnants of daylight casting long shadows across the ground. The park was nearly empty, save for a few bundled figures hurrying along the paths, their faces tucked against the wind. Lillian pulled her coat tighter around her and made her way toward the pond, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her breath coming out in soft clouds that hung in the air before her. As she rounded the bend in the path, she saw him. Alex stood by the pond, his back to her, his figure outlined against the pale sky. He wore a dark coat, his hands tucked into his pockets, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as though he were waiting for something or someone. Lillian stopped for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected to see him today, hadn't dared to hope that he would be here. But now that he was, standing there as if he had always been meant to be part of this landscape, something inside her shifted, a quiet sense of rightness settling over her. She took a deep breath and began to walk toward him, her steps careful on the frost-covered path. He didn't turn as she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence until she was nearly beside him. Then, as if sensing her arrival, he glanced over his shoulder. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. There was no surprise in his gaze, no hesitation, only the quiet recognition that had always existed between them, as though they had been expecting this meeting all along. Lillian stopped beside him, her gaze shifting to the pond, where the surface was beginning to freeze over in delicate patterns of ice. The water was still, save for a few ripples caused by the wind, and the sky above them was painted in shades of soft pink and blue. The scene was serene, peaceful, as though the park itself had fallen into a deep, quiet slumber. For a long time, they stood there in silence, side by side, their breaths rising in thin clouds that mingled with the cold air. The connection between them, though unspoken, was undeniable. There was no need for words, no need to break the quiet that surrounded them. Their presence beside each other was enough, filling the space between them with a warmth that defied the cold of the winter afternoon. As the light began to fade, casting the park in soft twilight, Lillian felt a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, just a quiet change, as though the moment itself was preparing to evolve into something more. She glanced over at Alex, her eyes catching the fading light in his expression, and she knew that he felt it too. Without a word, he turned and began to walk along the path, his steps slow and deliberate. Lillian hesitated for a moment, watching him move away from the pond before following. She didn't question it, didn't wonder where he was leading her. She simply fell into step beside him, their footsteps once again falling into that familiar rhythm, as though they had walked this path together many times before. They wandered through the park in the fading light, their surroundings growing quieter with each passing minute. The trees, bare and skeletal against the darkening sky, swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long, delicate shadows across the ground. The city beyond the park seemed distant, its hum of life muted and far away, leaving only the soft sounds of nature to fill the space between them. As they walked, Lillian felt the quiet connection between them deepen. It wasn't just the shared moments of silence or the proximity of their steps. It was something more, something unspoken, yet profound. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words even if she had wanted to. But it was there, tangible and real, growing with every step they took together. The path wound through the park, leading them deeper into its quiet heart. The world around them grew darker, the last remnants of daylight slipping away, replaced by the soft glow of streetlights that flickered on one by one. Lillian glanced over at Alex, his profile illuminated by the warm light, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. They reached a small clearing at the edge of the park, where a lone bench sat beneath a towering oak tree. Without a word, Alex slowed his pace, his gaze shifting to the bench as though it had called to him. Lillian followed his lead, and together they approached the bench, sitting down side by side in the fading light. The world around them was quiet, save for the distant rustle of leaves and the soft hum of the city in the distance. The air was cool against their skin, but Lillian felt warm, a quiet sense of contentment settling over her as they sat together in the stillness. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, the minutes passing slowly, yet without any sense of urgency. There was no need to rush, no need to fill the silence with anything other than their shared presence. They had found something special in this quiet space, a connection that went beyond words, beyond the ordinary flow of life. And in that moment, it was enough. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lillian and Alex remained where they were, sitting together in the quiet of the night. The park, now bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, seemed to wrap itself around them, cocooning them in a peace that neither of them had known before. And though no words passed between them, both Lillian and Alex knew, in the deepest parts of themselves, that they had found something rare and beautiful in each other. A bond that transcended the need for speech, a connection that would only grow stronger with time. They would meet again. Of that, they were certain. Chapter 6. Quiet Understandings. Winter settled over the city like a soft, heavy blanket. The first snow had come early, transforming the landscape into a hushed world of white. The park, which had been a palette of autumn golds and browns, was now buried under a thick layer of snow, the trees outlined in frost, their branches bending beneath the weight of ice. The pond had completely frozen over, its surface smooth and still, reflecting the pale winter sky like a sheet of glass. Lillian found herself walking through the park more often now, despite the cold. The crisp air, sharp against her cheeks, invigorated her, and there was something about the quiet of winter that matched her mood perfectly. The usual bustle of city life had slowed, the streets quieter, the noise muffled by the snow. Even the park, which had always been a sanctuary of calm, felt even more serene now, as if the world itself had slowed to match the gentle pace of falling snowflakes. She hadn't seen Alex in nearly a week, but the memory of their last shared walk remained with her, comforting and constant, like a soft thread connecting her to him even when they were apart. She didn't worry about when she might see him again, didn't feel the need to chase the next encounter. Instead, She trusted in the quiet rhythm they had found together, knowing that their paths would cross again when the time was right. That day, the park was nearly deserted. The snow had come down heavy the night before, and only a few brave souls had ventured out into the wintry landscape. Lillian's boots crunched softly in the snow as she walked, leaving a trail of shallow footprints behind her. The air was still, the sky overcast, casting the world in a soft, muted light. Every sound seemed distant, muffled by the thick blanket of snow, and Lillian found herself sinking deeper into the peaceful silence of the moment. Her thoughts wandered as she walked, though they always seemed to circle back to Alex. She wondered what he was doing today, whether he had also ventured into the park, or if he was somewhere else, lost in his own quiet reflections. Their time together had been so effortless, so natural, and yet, it had left such a deep impression on her. It wasn't like any relationship she had known before. There were no grand gestures, no words exchanged, and yet she felt closer to him than she had ever felt to anyone else. As she reached the familiar path that led toward the pond, she slowed her pace. The scene before her was one of perfect tranquility. The frozen pond, the snow-covered benches, the bare trees standing tall and silent against the gray sky. Lillian paused for a moment, simply taking it all in, letting the quiet of the park seep into her bones. And then, just as she had expected but not allowed herself to hope, she saw him. Alex was standing by the pond, his figure dark against the pale expanse of snow, just as he had been on that cold afternoon weeks before. He wore the same heavy coat, his scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, his hands deep in his pockets. His posture was relaxed, yet there was a quiet attentiveness in the way he stood, as though he were waiting, though not with any impatience, but with the calm certainty that what he waited for would come in its own time. Lillian's heart gave a soft flutter in her chest, a familiar warmth spreading through her despite the cold. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping forward, her feet crunching softly in the snow. As she drew closer, Alex turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers with that same quiet recognition she had come to expect. There was no surprise in his expression, only a calm acceptance, as though he had known all along that they would meet here again. She stopped beside him, her breath coming out in soft clouds of mist, and for a moment, they simply stood together, their gazes fixed on the frozen pond. The world around them was still and silent, the snow falling in slow, delicate flakes that drifted down like whispers from the sky. The connection between them, though unspoken, was as strong as ever, and once again, Lillian felt that quiet sense of rightness settle over her. Alex shifted slightly, his eyes turning from the pond to the path that wound through the trees. Without a word, he began to walk, and Lillian followed. There was no need for discussion, no need to ask where they were going. It was enough to simply be in each other's presence, to move together through the snow-covered landscape as they had done so many times before. The path was narrow, the snow deep in places, but they navigated it with ease, their steps falling into the familiar rhythm they had shared from the beginning. The park, usually so full of life even in the colder months, was now almost entirely theirs. The few other visitors had long since retreated to the warmth of their homes, leaving only Lillian and Alex to walk through the quiet wonderland that had unfolded around them. As they walked, Lillian's thoughts drifted to the way her life had changed in these past few weeks. It wasn't dramatic or obvious from the outside, but internally, something had shifted. The quiet companionship she had found with Alex had brought a kind of peace she hadn't known she was missing. There was no pressure to fill the silence between them with words or explanations. They simply existed together, sharing the quiet moments of life without expectation or demand. The snow continued to fall as they made their way deeper into the park, the trees standing like silent sentinels around them, their branches heavy with snow. Lillian glanced over at Alex, taking in the soft lines of his face, the way his expression remained calm and focused as they walked. She wondered what he was thinking, what thoughts filled his mind as they moved together through the winter landscape. But she didn't ask, didn't try to break the silence. There was no need. Whatever thoughts they each carried, they were part of the same quiet understanding that had brought them together in the first place. As they reached a small clearing, Alex slowed, his gaze shifting to a lone bench that sat beneath a towering pine tree. The bench was dusted with snow, its surface cold and untouched. Without hesitation, Alex brushed the snow away with a sweep of his hand and sat down, his eyes lifting to the sky, where the snowflakes continued to fall in a soft, steady rhythm. Lillian hesitated for only a moment before sitting beside him, her body sinking into the cold wood of the bench. The air was crisp and still, the snow falling around them in delicate flurries, and for a long time, they simply sat together, their breaths mingling in the cold air. The world beyond the park seemed far away, distant and irrelevant. Here, in this quiet space, everything else fell away, leaving only the soft presence of winter and the unspoken bond between them. The city, the noise, the busyness of life. All of it seemed to dissolve into the background, as if none of it mattered anymore. The minutes passed in silence, neither of them moving, neither of them speaking. Lillian's gaze remained fixed on the snow-covered landscape before them, her thoughts drifting in and out of focus. Every now and then, she would glance at Alex, taking in the calm stillness of his expression, the quiet strength in his presence. There was something deeply comforting about being with him like this, something that went beyond words or explanations. Eventually, the snow began to fall more heavily, the sky growing darker as the evening approached. Alex shifted slightly beside her, his breath a soft cloud of mist in the cold air. Lillian knew that it was time to go, though a part of her resisted the thought of leaving this quiet sanctuary they had found together. But even as they stood to leave, their steps slow and deliberate, Lillian felt no sadness. The park would be here tomorrow, just as it had always been, and she knew, just as surely as she knew the sun would rise in the morning, that they would meet again. There was no need for promises, no need for words. The understanding between them was enough, strong and steady, like the winter snow that fell softly around them. As they walked together toward the edge of the park, the city lights beginning to flicker on in the distance, Lillian felt a quiet warmth spread through her, despite the cold. This, whatever it was they had found together, was more than enough. And as the snow continued to fall, covering their footprints in a soft blanket of white, they disappeared into the winter evening, their connection as strong and unspoken as ever. Chapter 7. Beneath the Winter Sky. Winter deepened as December wore on, the days growing shorter, the nights longer and colder. The park, once a vibrant tapestry of seasons changing, was now frozen in time beneath a thick layer of snow. The branches of the trees stood bare and motionless, covered in frost that shimmered in the pale daylight. The pond had become a solid expanse of ice, its surface unbroken and smooth, mirroring the quiet stillness of the world around it. Lillian's routine had not changed. She still made her way to the park each afternoon, despite the cold that bit at her skin and the wind that whipped through the streets. Her life, outside the park, was filled with the same steady rhythm of work and solitary evenings in her apartment, but the hours she spent in the park had become the moments she cherished most. Each walk along the snow-covered paths felt like a return to something familiar, something peaceful, and in her heart, she knew that the quiet presence of Alex would eventually meet her there again. The city beyond the park moved with the frenetic pace of the holiday season. People rushed about, their faces hidden beneath scarves and hats, carrying bags filled with gifts, moving in and out of the stores decorated with twinkling lights. The festive energy of the city was palpable, but Lillian remained on the periphery, content to observe from a distance. The holidays had never held much meaning for her, and this year was no different. Yet, there was a strange sense of contentment she couldn't quite explain, a quiet joy she found in simply walking through the city, knowing the park and its stillness awaited her. On one particularly cold afternoon, the sky was a brilliant blue, a rare gift in the heart of winter. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow and painting the world in soft hues of gold and silver. Lillian stepped into the park, her boots sinking into the snow with each step, the air crisp and fresh, filling her lungs with every breath. The familiar paths stretched before her, winding through the white-draped landscape, and once again, her heart began to search for him, the now routine hope flickering within her that today would bring another shared moment of silent understanding. As she approached the pond, her gaze lifted, and there he was, standing at the edge of the ice, his figure still and steady, as though he were waiting for the day itself to unfold. Alex had become a part of the park in her mind, inseparable from its quiet beauty, a presence that belonged to the very fabric of the place. She didn't hurry her steps, but instead let the moment stretch, savoring the sight of him there, framed by the vast winter sky. When she finally reached him, they stood side by side, the frozen pond before them, the sky overhead a deepening blue as the sun began its slow descent. Lillian's breath misted in the cold air, her cheeks tinged pink from the chill, but there was a warmth in her chest that had little to do with the temperature. It was the warmth of familiarity, of connection, the simple knowledge that they were together again, sharing the same space, the same silence. The pond was a perfect mirror, reflecting the sky and the snow-laden trees in stark clarity. There was a beauty in the stillness, in the way the world seemed to hold its breath in these quiet moments. Lillian let her thoughts drift as she stood there, feeling the weight of the winter air settle around her like a soft, heavy blanket. She had grown accustomed to this kind of quiet, the kind that stretched out between her and Alex, the kind that asked for nothing and gave everything. It was in these moments, standing side by side with him, that she felt the most grounded, the most present. The world around them might be cold and still, but there was a warmth, an unspoken connection that filled the space between them. The soft crunch of snow underfoot was the only sound as they moved together along the edge of the pond. The light was beginning to change, the golden hues deepening into a soft amber as the sun sank lower in the sky. Shadows stretched across the frozen surface of the pond, their elongated forms creating a stark contrast against the shimmering ice. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow, as if they too were watching over the stillness of the scene. As they walked, Lillian found herself thinking about the passage of time, about how quickly the days seemed to slip away now. It was almost the end of the year, and yet, in many ways, it felt as though the year had only just begun. She thought of the first time she had seen Alex in the park, that quiet, chance encounter that had led to something more, something deeper. Without words, without explanation, they had come to share these moments, and Lillian couldn't imagine her days without them now. The snow began to fall again, gently at first, tiny flakes drifting down from the sky like pieces of a dream. Lillian glanced over at Alex, watching as the snow collected on his dark coat, dusting his shoulders and hair with white. His face remained calm, serene, his eyes focused on the path ahead, though Lillian knew he was as aware of her presence as she was of his. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that told her he too cherished these quiet moments they shared. The path they walked wound its way through the park, leading them past benches buried beneath the snow, their wooden slats barely visible. The world around them seemed untouched, as though they were the only two people who existed in this wintry landscape. It was a comforting thought that in this vast city, with all its noise and chaos, they had found a place that was theirs, a place where time slowed and the rest of the world faded away. As they reached a familiar clearing, Alex slowed his pace, and Lillian instinctively did the same. The clearing was wide and open, the ground covered in a thick layer of untouched snow. The sky above had deepened into a dusky blue, the first stars beginning to twinkle faintly in the growing twilight. The air was cold, but not harsh, and the snow continued to fall softly around them, creating a world that felt both magical and distant from the ordinary. Alex stopped in the middle of the clearing, turning slightly to face the horizon. Lillian stood beside him, her breath coming out in soft clouds, her gaze following his. The city lights in the distance were barely visible, muted by the falling snow, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. It was a moment suspended in time, one of those rare, perfect moments where everything seemed to fall into place, where nothing more was needed. Lillian's thoughts wandered back to the year that was ending. It had been a year of change, of quiet growth, and of unexpected connections. She had learned to find peace in the stillness, to appreciate the beauty in the small, everyday moments. And most of all, she had learned to let go of the need for explanations or definitions. Whatever this was, this thing she shared with Alex, it didn't need to be named or understood. It simply was. The snowflakes fell faster now, swirling around them in delicate patterns, catching the light of the stars as they descended. Lillian felt a sense of calm wash over her, a deep contentment that settled in her chest. There was no rush, no urgency to move or to speak. The quiet was enough. The presence of Alex beside her was enough. As the evening settled in and the cold deepened, they turned to leave the clearing, their steps slow and unhurried. The path ahead was illuminated by the soft glow of the snow and the fading light of the day. Lillian knew that soon they would part ways, each returning to their own quiet lives, but the thought didn't trouble her. She knew now that they would always find their way back to each other, just as they had done since that first afternoon in the park. And so, they walked, side by side, through the falling snow, the world around them quiet and still. Winter had arrived in full force, but within the silence of the season, Lillian had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A connection that transcended words, a quiet understanding that filled the empty spaces of her life. As they reached the edge of the park, Lillian paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on the snow-covered trees and the frozen pond beyond. The park had become a place of refuge, a place where she could simply be without expectation or demand. And in that quiet space, she had found something more, a bond that had formed in the stillness, a bond that needed no words to be felt. With one last look at the winter landscape, Lillian turned and continued her walk, her heart light and her mind at ease. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground in a soft blanket of white, erasing their footprints as they disappeared into the night. Chapter 8. A slow thaw. The days had grown even shorter, the air colder, as January arrived. The city was locked in the heart of winter, a season that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Yet, beneath the layers of snow, there were small, almost imperceptible signs that the world was beginning its slow, steady march towards spring. Lillian noticed it in the subtle shift of light, the way the sun, though low on the horizon, lingered just a little longer in the afternoons, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered park. The air, though still cold, carried with it the faintest promise of warmth, as if the earth itself was beginning to stir from its long slumber. Lillian found herself drawn to the park even more during these winter days. Each walk felt like a quiet meditation, a time to reflect and to reconnect with the stillness that had become such a comforting presence in her life. She no longer questioned why she came here or what she sought in these solitary moments. It was enough to simply be in the park, to let the rhythm of her steps guide her along the familiar paths, to feel the cold air against her skin and the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots. The world outside the park felt distant, almost unreal, as if the city itself had taken on a dreamlike quality in the depths of winter. The noise and movement of daily life were muffled by the snow, and Lillian often felt as though she were the only one awake in a world that had gone quiet. The streets were quieter now, the holiday rush long over, and many of the park's usual visitors had retreated to the warmth of their homes. But Lillian didn't mind the solitude. It was in these quiet, reflective moments that she felt most at peace. As she entered the park one afternoon, the sky was a soft, pale gray, thick with clouds that promised more snow. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, dusted with frost. The pond, still frozen solid, reflected the overcast sky in a dull, metallic sheen. The wind was gentle but cold, nipping at Lillian's face as she made her way along the path. It had been several days since she had seen Alex, though she didn't dwell on his absence. Their meetings had always been unplanned, spontaneous, and that was part of what made them so special. There was no expectation, no need to fill the silence with explanations or promises. They would meet again when the time was right, just as they always had. And until then, Lillian was content to walk through the park, alone with her thoughts, her breath misting in the cold air. As she neared the pond, she paused for a moment, taking in the familiar sight. The snow lay thick and untouched, the ice of the pond smooth and unbroken. The park was as still and quiet as it had ever been. The only sounds the faint rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant chirping of birds. Lillian breathed deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs, her eyes wandering over the landscape. It was in moments like these that she felt a deep connection to the world around her, a sense of belonging that went beyond the physical. The park, with its quiet beauty and its ever-changing seasons, had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could escape the busyness of life and simply be. And though she had come here alone, she never truly felt lonely. The memories of her walks with Alex, the quiet companionship they had shared, lingered in the air, like a soft echo of something timeless and unspoken. As she stood there, her thoughts drifting like the snowflakes that fell softly around her, she caught sight of something in the distance, a figure moving slowly along the path that wound through the trees. Her heart quickened for a moment, though she didn't allow herself to hope too quickly. She watched as the figure came closer, the familiar silhouette gradually becoming clearer. It was Alex, walking with that same easy, steady pace, his coat pulled tightly around him, his breath misting in the cold air. Lillian felt a sense of calm wash over her as she watched him approach, her heart settling into a quiet, steady rhythm. There was no need to rush toward him, no need to call out or wave. She simply waited, knowing that he would join her soon enough, just as he always had. When Alex finally reached her, he stopped beside her, his gaze turning to the frozen pond in front of them. For a long time, they stood together in silence, their breath mingling in the cold air, their eyes fixed on the stillness of the pond. The snow fell softly around them, covering the ground in a fresh layer of white, erasing the footprints of those who had walked the paths before them. There was something different in the air today, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that Lillian couldn't quite put into words. The park, though still blanketed in snow, felt less frozen, less locked in the grip of winter. There was a softness to the light, a gentleness in the way the wind moved through the trees. It was as if the earth itself was beginning to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, as if testing the waters of the coming thaw. Lillian let her thoughts drift as they stood there, side by side, their connection as quiet and unspoken as ever. She thought about the time they had spent together, the walks they had shared in this very park, and how those moments, though fleeting, had left such a lasting impression on her. There was something about Alex, something steady and constant, that had become a source of comfort for her. In a world that was always changing, always moving forward, their time together felt like a moment of stillness, a pause in the rush of life. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken, the pale gray clouds thickening as the snow continued to fall. The wind picked up slightly, swirling the snow in gentle gusts around them. Lillian could feel the chill deepening in the air, but she didn't move, didn't feel the need to seek warmth or shelter. She was content to stand here, beside Alex, in the quiet of the park, surrounded by the beauty of winter. Eventually, Alex shifted slightly, turning his gaze from the pond to the path ahead. Without a word, he began to walk, and Lillian followed, their steps falling into the same easy rhythm they had shared from the beginning. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots, the only sound in the otherwise silent park. As they walked, Lillian felt a sense of clarity settle over her, a quiet understanding that had been slowly forming in her heart. She didn't need to name what she and Alex shared, didn't need to define it or put it into words. It was enough to simply be together, to share these moments of stillness and peace, to know that they understood each other in a way that went beyond words. The path wound through the park, leading them past familiar landmarks, the benches, the trees, the frozen pond, each one a reminder of the time they had spent here together. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy now, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The world around them was soft and quiet, as if the park itself had become a sanctuary, a place where time moved more slowly, where the noise of the outside world could not reach them. As they reached the edge of the park, the city lights flickering in the distance, Lillian felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew that they would part ways soon, just as they always did, but she also knew that this was not the end. There would be more walks, more moments shared in the quiet of the park, more time to simply be together. And so, as they stepped out of the park and into the city streets, the snow falling around them in soft, swirling patterns, Lillian felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. Whatever the future held, she knew that they would always find their way back to each other, just as they had from the beginning. With that thought, she turned and walked into the night, her heart light, her mind at ease, knowing that the park and Alex would be waiting for her when she returned. Chapter 9. Unspoken Words. The frost had begun to lose its grip on the city as February came to an end. There were signs, subtle but unmistakable, that spring was inching closer. Small buds on the trees, the occasional brightening of the sky, and the way the air seemed to carry a softer, warmer edge. But winter still held sway, and the park remained frozen, a quiet, slumbering world, still cocooned in ice and snow. Lillian found herself drawn to the park each day, just as she had been for months now. It had become a place of calm and clarity, a sanctuary from the noise and chaos of life outside its borders. The days were still short, the nights long and dark, but in the park, time felt suspended, as if nothing could break the peace that settled over it. She would arrive, walking along the snow-covered paths, her breath visible in the cold air, and she would lose herself in the rhythm of her steps. It was always quiet here, but it was a good kind of quiet, a peaceful silence that wrapped around her like a blanket, a space where she could just be. Alex had not been there for the past few days, but Lillian did not feel the weight of his absence as she once might have. She had grown accustomed to their unspoken rhythm, the way they would meet when the moment was right, without need for plans or expectations. It was an unspoken understanding between them, and though there were times when she would catch herself hoping for his presence, she knew that it would come in its own time, just as it always had. Lillian's footsteps crunched softly in the snow as she made her way down a familiar path, one that led her toward the pond, still frozen, still reflecting the world above. The sky was a pale gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy, and the air was still and quiet, as though the park itself were holding its breath. It was a day much like any other, and yet there was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet anticipation that she could not quite explain. As she reached the pond, she paused for a moment, her gaze drifting across its smooth, icy surface. The snow had settled in even patterns, creating a soft, white blanket that stretched endlessly before her. The trees that lined the edge of the pond were still bare, their branches heavy with frost, but there was something more delicate about the scene today, something that felt like the beginning of a change. She wondered about the months ahead. What would come when the ice finally began to melt, when the snow would give way to the green of spring, when the park would begin to bloom again? She had spent so many months in this still, frozen world, and though it had been a comforting retreat, she could not help but wonder what it would be like to see the park in a new light, to witness the transformation that always came with the changing seasons. Lillian took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cold, crisp air. The silence around her felt alive in a way that was hard to describe, a kind of quiet energy that pulsed in the stillness of the park. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet wash over her, feeling the weight of the snow that clung to the trees, the soft pressure of the cold that pressed against her skin. It was a moment of reflection, a time for her to simply exist in the space between the present and the future. As she opened her eyes, she saw him, Alex, walking toward her, his dark figure emerging from the misty gray of the distance. He moved slowly, his coat pulled tightly around him against the cold, but there was a certain ease to his steps, a kind of quiet confidence that made her heart skip a beat. She did not hurry to meet him, but instead watched him approach, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, just as it always did. When he reached her, they stood together in silence, their eyes meeting briefly before both of them turned their gaze back to the pond. There was no need for words between them, no need to acknowledge the time that had passed since they last saw each other. Their connection had always transcended the need for explanation, and today, that unspoken bond felt stronger than ever. The snow began to fall again, small, delicate flakes drifting down from the gray sky, coating the world in a fresh layer of white. It was a soft, peaceful snowfall, the kind that seemed to blanket everything in calm. They stood together, watching the snow as it settled over the pond, the landscape around them growing more serene with each passing moment. The air was colder now, the light fading slowly as the afternoon began to turn toward evening. And still, they remained silent, standing side by side, feeling the presence of one another without words. There was a quiet comfort in their companionship, an understanding that didn't need to be voiced. Alex shifted slightly, glancing at Lillian, his eyes soft, as though they were communicating something that went beyond language. Lillian met his gaze, her heart swelling with a quiet warmth. She knew that there was something between them that couldn't be defined or explained, but it didn't matter. They had always been this way, two people who simply understood each other without the need for spoken words. As the minutes passed, the world around them began to change. The sun had set, and the park was bathed in the soft, muted light of dusk. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, turning the landscape into a winter wonderland. Lillian felt a sense of peace settle in her chest, a quiet happiness that came from being here, in this moment, with Alex. They began to walk, their steps crunching softly in the snow, following the familiar path that wound through the trees and around the pond. There was no destination, no urgency in their movement. They simply walked, side by side, lost in the quiet beauty of the park, their thoughts turning inward, each lost in the unspoken rhythm they had created together. As they reached the clearing near the center of the park, Lillian stopped, her gaze drifting up to the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to appear, tiny pinpricks of light against the deepening blue of the evening. She felt a sense of wonder as she watched the stars emerge, their presence a reminder of the vastness of the world, and yet how small and intimate the moments they shared felt. Alex stopped beside her, his gaze following hers, though neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out between them, filling the space with a sense of calm and connection. It was a moment that felt timeless, as if they were suspended in a place where nothing could touch them, where the rest of the world had faded away. Lillian closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peaceful quiet of the park wrap around her. She felt the weight of the cold, the crisp air that filled her lungs, the soft pressure of Alex's presence beside her. She was content in this stillness, in this moment of shared silence. She didn't need to understand it, didn't need to put it into words. What they had was simply there, a quiet, unspoken bond that needed no explanation. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself smiling, a small, contented smile that spoke of the peace she had found in this connection. Alex glanced at her, a faint smile of his own forming, and for a moment, they both understood the quiet joy that came from being together without words. It was the kind of happiness that didn't need to be said aloud, the kind that was felt in the space between them, in the shared silences and the quiet moments of connection. As the night deepened, they began to make their way back toward the edge of the park. The stars were fully visible now, sparkling brightly in the cold winter sky. The park was still, the snow continuing to fall in soft, swirling patterns around them, but Lillian felt lighter, as though something had shifted in the quiet of the evening. They would go their separate ways, as they always did, but the bond between them had only deepened. It was a bond that didn't require words, didn't need to be defined. It simply was, quiet, constant, and undeniably real. And that was enough. Chapter 10. The Space Between. The days were beginning to lengthen again, the slow, steady march towards spring continuing. The world outside the park had begun to stir with the promise of change, but inside the boundaries of the park, winter still reigned. The air was crisp and cold, the snow still thick upon the ground, yet beneath the surface, there was a sense of anticipation. Lillian could feel it in the way the wind began to carry a slight warmth, a hint of something different, something that spoke of renewal and growth. It had been nearly a week since Lillian had last seen Alex. She had missed their unspoken conversations, the quiet understanding that passed between them with each glance, each moment they shared without needing to fill the silence with words. They had fallen into a rhythm that suited them both, simple, unhurried, and without expectation. But now, in the stretch of days that had passed without him, Lillian found herself missing him more than she had anticipated. It wasn't the need for conversation or company that she missed, but the feeling of presence, the way their silences had become a shared language, one that spoke of something deeper, something beyond the realm of words. The park had begun to change too, though in subtle ways. The snow had grown thinner, the ground beneath it harder, as the days warmed ever so slightly. Small hints of life began to appear, In the way the trees seemed less brittle, their bare branches holding a faint promise of green beneath the frost. Lillian found herself drawn to the park more often now, eager to experience the quiet beauty of the slow transition from winter to spring. She would arrive early in the morning, before the park was filled with the occasional jogger or family enjoying a rare moment of sunlight. The mornings were still cold, the air still sharp, but there was a lightness in the way the light played upon the snow, a quiet reassurance that the world was slowly waking up. One morning, as she made her way toward the pond, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of clouds that cast a soft gray light over everything. The park was empty, save for the occasional bird flitting through the trees, and the stillness of the world around her felt almost sacred, as if time had stopped for a moment. She walked along the path, her thoughts drifting, when she spotted something in the distance, someone walking toward her. It was Alex. His figure was distant at first, but as he drew closer, the weight of his presence began to fill the space between them. For a moment, she simply watched him, her heart picking up slightly in her chest, though she didn't hurry to meet him. There was something comforting about the way they had come to understand one another, something deeper than just a shared affection. It was as though they had created a space between them that was filled with mutual respect and understanding, and that space, though silent, was enough. When he finally reached her, there was no immediate need to say anything. They simply stood there, side by side, looking out over the frozen pond. The snow was still heavy on the ground, the ice thick and still, though there was a quiet promise of change beneath its surface. Lillian felt the weight of the silence around them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was as if the air between them had become a shared space, a place where words were not necessary, where the quiet of the park spoke for them both. For a while, they walked together, not rushing, simply moving at their own pace. The ground was still covered in snow, but the edges of the path were beginning to show signs of thawing, the ice slowly melting away to reveal patches of brown grass beneath. It was a slow, gradual process, much like the way Lillian felt their connection was growing, a subtle, unspoken bond that was slowly, steadily becoming something deeper, something more. As they walked, Lillian's thoughts wandered to the past months. How much had changed since they first met, and how little had really changed between them. She had come to realize that, in their shared silences, they had found a kind of comfort that went beyond conversation. It wasn't about filling the space with words, but about existing together in the same moment, in the same space. And in that, there was a kind of intimacy that no conversation could ever create. They continued along the path, the park unfolding around them in the stillness of the morning. The trees were quiet, the birds rare, but there was a feeling of something waiting beneath the surface, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for the shift of seasons. It was in moments like this that Lillian found herself becoming more attuned to the rhythms of the world around her. She could feel the subtle changes, the way the air had a different quality, the way the snow was beginning to soften, the way the sky was slowly shifting from gray to a pale blue. Alex was walking beside her, but there was no need for words, no need to fill the silence with small talk. There was something about the way he moved that told her he felt the same, content to be in this moment with her, to share the quiet of the park, the quiet of winter slowly giving way to the promise of something new. His presence was a comfort, a steady anchor in the world that felt so often in flux. And though they didn't speak, though the silence stretched between them, there was a sense of connection that was undeniable. The park began to change before them, not in grand gestures, but in small, almost imperceptible ways. The trees, still bare, began to show tiny buds along their branches, and the air, though still sharp, carried a scent of damp earth, a hint of something fresh, something alive. The thaw had begun, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. Lillian found herself thinking about what lay ahead, about the shift from winter to spring, about the way the seasons changed, and how, in the same way, she and Alex had changed, though it was hard to pinpoint exactly how. It was as if their connection had deepened without either of them acknowledging it, as if they had simply grown closer, without the need for words or declarations. The space between them had become more than just silence. It had become a place of mutual understanding, a space where they could simply be, without expectations, without pressure. They stopped by the edge of the pond, where the ice was beginning to crack, the surface breaking up in small, irregular patterns, as if it were slowly giving way to the warmth beneath. Lillian watched as a small breeze swept across the ice, causing the cracks to widen, the ice to shift and break. It was a subtle, quiet transformation, and yet it felt significant. She could almost feel the change in the air, the world coming alive again, as if the park itself were waking up from a long, deep sleep. Alex stood beside her, watching the same scene, though his gaze was distant, lost in thought. There was a stillness to him, a calm that Lillian had come to recognize as part of him. He had always been a quiet person, and though they had shared many moments together in silence, there was something about this moment, about the way the world was beginning to change, that made it feel as though the silence held more weight than ever before. They stood together for a long time, side by side, watching the ice crack and shift beneath the surface of the pond. The snow continued to fall gently, soft flakes drifting from the sky and settling on the ground around them. And as they stood there, in the quiet of the morning, Lillian felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. There was no need for words, no need to fill the silence with explanations or promises. The connection between them was enough, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. Eventually, they began to walk again, moving slowly along the path, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet. The air was still cold, but there was a warmth beginning to seep into the world, a subtle shift that told them that spring was coming, even if it was still far off. And as they walked, side by side, in the quiet of the park, Lillian knew that whatever lay ahead, the space between them would always remain. It was a space filled with understanding, with connection, with the quiet, unspoken promise of something more. And that, she realized, was enough. Chapter 11. A New Beginning. March had begun, and the world felt like it was slowly waking up from a deep slumber. The park, which had been cloaked in a quiet, icy stillness for months, was now showing the first signs of change. The snow that had once blanketed the ground in a thick, impenetrable layer was beginning to recede, revealing patches of brown, damp earth. The trees, still bare, held small buds on their branches, delicate and uncertain, as though unsure of the coming season. The air had a hint of warmth, a slight shift from the biting cold of the months before. The days were longer now, the sun hanging in the sky for a little while longer before sinking into the horizon. Lillian walked along the familiar path that wound through the park, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her breath visible in the cold air. She had come to expect the quiet, the solitude that accompanied her morning walks. But today, there was a different feeling in the air, something that she could not quite place. A feeling of expectation, as though the world itself was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the shift that was about to come. She had come to the park every day for months now, ever since the beginning of winter, when the days were short and the nights long, when the park had felt like a refuge from the noise of life. She had come here to think, to find clarity, to be alone with her thoughts. But as the days passed and the seasons began to change, so too did her feelings. She had begun to see the park not just as a place of solitude, but as a place of transition, a place where things were beginning to shift and grow. It was as though the park, too, was waking up, shedding the weight of winter, preparing for the promise of spring. It was here, in this quiet, slowly transforming world, that she had come to understand the depth of her feelings for Alex. They had grown closer without even realizing it, their unspoken connection becoming stronger with each passing day. They had fallen into a rhythm, two people who did not need words to understand each other, two people who could simply exist in each other's presence and be content. Their silences had become a language of their own, one that spoke of trust, of comfort, and of something more. She had no idea when it had happened, when the shift in her heart had occurred. It had been so gradual, so natural, that she had hardly noticed it until now. But she had come to realize that what she felt for Alex was more than just friendship. It was something deeper, something that had been growing steadily beneath the surface, like the slow thawing of the ground after a long, harsh winter. And now, as the world began to change, so too did the nature of her feelings. The weight of them seemed to press against her chest, a quiet, unspoken truth that she could no longer ignore. She didn't need to say it aloud, didn't need to put it into words. She could feel it, as clearly as she could feel the warmth of the sun on her face, or the cool breeze that ruffled her hair. She was drawn to him, not just by the comfort of their silences, but by the quiet strength of their connection, by the way he made her feel like she could simply be herself, without the need to explain, to justify, to fill the space with noise. Lillian paused at the edge of the pond, her breath catching in her throat as she looked out over the still, frozen surface. The ice had begun to crack, breaking into jagged pieces that floated in the water, as though the pond were slowly starting to come alive again. The snow, too, had started to thin, revealing patches of grass and dirt beneath it, as if the world was slowly shedding its winter coat, preparing for the new life that was about to emerge. The air smelled different now, fresh, clean, and slightly damp. It was the scent of something new, of growth, of possibility. The weight of the past few months, the quiet isolation that had come with the cold, was slowly lifting. It felt like the beginning of something, though Lillian could not yet name it. She could feel the change in the air, in the way the earth was beginning to stir beneath the snow, in the way the sun was shining a little brighter each day, warming the world just a little bit more. She stood there for a while, watching the pond, watching the ice slowly melt, and she let her thoughts drift. She thought about Alex, about their moments together, about how they had grown so close without ever having to say anything, without needing to define what was happening between them. And though she could not name it, though it had never been spoken aloud, she knew that there was something between them that was undeniable, something that had been quietly growing all along. And yet, even as she stood there, feeling the pull of that connection, she couldn't help but wonder about the future. What would happen when the ice finally gave way to the warmth of spring? What would happen when the world began to bloom again? When the park was no longer a quiet, frozen place, but a vibrant, living world? Would their connection change, too? Would the weight of unspoken feelings become too much to carry, or would it continue to grow, quietly and steadily, until it became something more? The thought lingered in her mind as she began to walk again, her steps slow and steady as she made her way along the path. She didn't have any answers, didn't know what the future held, but she knew that the connection between her and Alex was real, and that it was something worth exploring, something worth holding on to. She had come to understand that love was not always about grand gestures or declarations. It was not always about filling the space with words or expectations. Sometimes, love was simply about presence, about being there for each other in the quiet moments, about sharing a silence that spoke louder than any conversation could. It was about feeling something without needing to name it, about knowing that something was growing beneath the surface, even if it hadn't yet fully bloomed. As the days passed, the park continued to change, just as Lillian did. The ice on the pond began to break apart, the water slowly beginning to flow once more. The snow receded, revealing patches of brown grass and earth. The trees, still bare, held tight to their buds, waiting for the warmth of spring to coax them into bloom. And through it all, Lillian walked. She walked through the park every day, finding peace in the quiet, finding comfort in the space between her and Alex. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. They didn't need to fill the silence with words. The connection between them was enough, and that was all that mattered. The days grew longer, the sun rising higher in the sky, and though the world was still wrapped in the quiet of winter, Lillian could feel the promise of change in the air. It was the beginning of something new, something that had been quietly building beneath the surface for months. And as the park began to bloom, so too did the possibilities for the future. In the end, it was a simple truth, one that Lillian had come to realize over the past few months. She didn't need to know what would happen next, or where this connection with Alex would lead. She didn't need to define it, or put it into words. All she knew was that it was there, quietly growing, waiting for the right moment to bloom. And in that, there was a quiet, unspoken promise of something more, something that would come in its own time, when the world was ready for it. Chapter 12. The Unspoken Path. The morning had arrived with a light mist that hovered over the park like a veil, soft and quiet, as though the world were holding its breath. Lillian had always loved this time of year, when the air still held the remnants of winter but hinted at the coming warmth of spring. The trees were beginning to bud, their branches trembling with anticipation, and the first delicate shoots of grass were beginning to break through the ground, reaching up toward the sky in their fragile, hopeful way. Everything seemed to be on the edge of transformation. For Lillian, these mornings had become a time of reflection, a space where her mind could wander and her heart could be heard. She had walked this path for months now, and though the park was ever-changing, the rhythm of her walks had remained the same. She moved with the same steady, purposeful pace, as though each step brought her closer to something she couldn't quite name. There was a stillness around her, a quiet that allowed her thoughts to expand and deepen, and today, more than ever, she felt that unspoken connection between her and Alex pull at the edges of her heart. In the weeks since their quiet moments by the pond, there had been a subtle shift in the air between them. It was not an overwhelming change, not something that could be marked by words or gestures, but something that had deepened all the same. Their time together had become more frequent, the silences more comfortable, and the space between them, once filled with uncertainty, had become a place of understanding. There was no pressure to say the right things, no need for declarations or promises. They had found a rhythm, a way of existing side by side, that felt just right. But as the days passed and the world around her continued to change, Lillian found herself wondering about the future. She had always been someone who cherished the quiet, the slow, gentle unfolding of things, and yet, for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of anticipation. The connection she had with Alex was growing, becoming something more with each passing day, but what that something more looked like, she couldn't quite tell. There was no blueprint, no clear path ahead. It was as though they were moving through a fog, unsure of what lay just beyond their reach, but knowing, somehow, that they were heading towards something important. As she walked along the path, the mist clinging to the grass and trees, she found herself thinking about the moments they had shared, how they had grown closer without the need for words, how their presence in each other's lives had become a quiet, reassuring constant. It was in the simple things, like the way Alex would show up at the park at the same time every day, or the way he would walk beside her without ever needing to say a word. It was in the small gestures, the unspoken understanding that passed between them. And as much as Lillian had tried to keep her feelings in check, to not let them grow into something more than they had to be, she knew that her heart had already fallen. She had learned, in these months of walking alone and walking with Alex, that love was not always a grand, sweeping thing. It was not always about the moments of passion or the bold gestures. Sometimes, love was quiet. It was in the way you could sit together, side by side, and not feel the need to speak. It was in the way a look or a touch could carry more meaning than any conversation. And though Lillian had never been one to chase after love, never been someone to seek out grand gestures or declarations, she knew that what she felt for Alex was different. It was as if their hearts had found each other in a place where words were unnecessary. But the question remained, what would happen next? As the days grew longer and the world around her continued to thaw, so too did the space between her and Alex. The park, once a place of solitude and quiet reflection, had become a place of anticipation, a place where the unspoken connection between them was growing stronger with each passing day. And yet, despite the closeness they had found, Lillian couldn't help but wonder if they were standing on the edge of something more, something that would change everything. She turned the corner of the path, her footsteps crunching softly in the remnants of snow, and as she did, her eyes caught sight of Alex ahead, sitting on a bench by the pond. He was looking out over the water, his gaze distant, as though lost in thought. The pond had changed since their last visit. The ice had completely melted, leaving only the still, clear water behind, reflecting the gray sky above. The trees, once bare and cold, were beginning to show signs of life, small buds forming along their branches, waiting for the warmth of the sun to coax them into bloom. Lillian's heart quickened at the sight of him, a familiar warmth spreading through her chest. He hadn't noticed her yet, but she could see the quiet peace that surrounded him, the same peace that she had come to associate with their time together. It was in these moments, when he was simply present, when he was simply being, that she felt the weight of their connection the most. There was no need for words, no need for explanations. They simply existed together in this shared space, two people who had found something in each other that went beyond the surface, something that transcended the need for conversation or grand gestures. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, not rushing, just enjoying the quiet of the morning. As she drew closer, Alex's head turned slightly, as though sensing her approach, but he said nothing. There was no need to. Their eyes met for a moment, a brief glance that held more meaning than words ever could. And in that instant, Lillian felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. Something that had been growing between them for weeks, something that had been waiting for the right moment to come to the surface. They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking out over the pond, both lost in their own thoughts, but both aware of the unspoken connection that bound them together. It was in the way the air felt around them, in the way the world seemed to quiet, as though holding its breath in anticipation of what might come next. The mist swirled around them, soft and silent, and the park felt like a world all its own, a place where time had slowed, where the noise of the outside world couldn't reach. And yet, despite the silence, Lillian could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet tension that lingered between them. It was a tension that had been building for weeks, a quiet, unspoken pressure that had grown with each shared moment, each glance, each breath they took together. It was as if the air around them had become charged with possibility, with the promise of something more. But what that something more was, Lillian couldn't say. She didn't know if Alex felt the same way she did, if he had come to see her the way she had come to see him. There was no way to know for sure, no way to put it into words, no way to bridge the space between them that had grown so comfortable, so steady, yet so uncertain. She took a step closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest, and as she did, Alex shifted slightly on the bench, his body turning toward her just enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. There was no need for words. There was no need for declarations. The space between them was enough. The quiet understanding they had built over the months was enough. And so, they stood there, side by side, in the quiet of the park, watching the pond, watching the world change around them. The stillness was no longer uncomfortable. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was a space of possibility, a space where two people could simply exist together, knowing that something was growing between them, even if they couldn't yet name it. As the sun began to break through the clouds, casting a soft light across the water, Lillian felt a sense of peace settle over her. It was the peace that came from knowing that they were on the same path, even if that path wasn't yet clear. They had found something in each other, something quiet and steady, something that needed no words, and in that, there was a comfort she had never known before. The world was changing. Spring was coming. And so, too, was the next step in their journey, whatever that might be. Chapter 13. The Weight of Change. The days had grown noticeably longer, stretching into the evenings with a soft golden light that warmed the earth. Lillian noticed how the sun seemed to linger a little longer each day, its rays breaking through the branches of the trees, casting long shadows across the park. The world had begun to awaken in ways both subtle and bold. The once barren trees were now adorned with buds that glistened in the sunlight, promising the arrival of new life. The pond, too, had transformed, its surface now reflecting the clear blue sky, the water shimmering under the warm embrace of the sun. As she walked through the park, Lillian couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. It wasn't just the change in the season, though that was part of it, the slow thawing of the world after a long, cold winter. It was more than that. It was as though the air around her was charged with something unspoken, a feeling she had been unable to put into words but had been carrying with her for weeks. It was a weight that pressed gently against her chest, as though the future, with all its possibilities and uncertainties, was drawing near. Her steps were slow and measured, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The crisp air filled her lungs, and with each breath, she felt more grounded, more present in the world around her. There was a quiet stillness to the morning, a peace that wrapped around her like a protective cloak, allowing her to think clearly, to focus on what had been growing in the space between her and Alex. They had shared so many quiet moments together in the park, and though they had never spoken of it, Their bond had deepened in ways that neither of them had expected. They had found something in each other that was not dependent on words or grand gestures. It was in the way their silences had become comfortable, in the way they could simply be together without the need to fill the space with conversation. It was in the way Alex would walk beside her, not asking for anything, not needing to say anything, and yet offering a presence that was more than enough. But there was also a weight, a tension that had settled between them, and Lillian felt it more acutely with each passing day. The connection between them had become undeniable. It had grown steadily, like a flower unfolding, reaching toward the light, yet still unsure of what it would become. Lillian had never been one to rush into things, and the unspoken nature of their bond had made her hesitant to confront what was happening. But as the days passed, she could feel the pull of it, the quiet promise of something deeper. It was the little things that spoke to her. The way Alex's presence seemed to bring a sense of calm to her world, how the simple act of walking together felt like an unspoken affirmation of the connection they shared. And yet, she wondered if they were both afraid of naming it, afraid of what it might mean to acknowledge the depth of what they had begun to build. The silence between them had always been comfortable, but now it carried with it a sense of uncertainty, as though both of them were waiting for something to shift, to happen, but neither knew exactly what. Lillian knew she could not stay in this suspended space forever. The weight of the unspoken truth, what she felt for Alex, was growing, pressing against the walls she had so carefully built around her heart. She had spent so many months in this quiet, steady rhythm, finding peace in the moments they shared, in the space between them. But as the world around her changed, as spring began to unfurl itself, she knew that the time was coming to face what was truly happening between them. She stopped for a moment on the path, looking out at the pond. The water was still, the surface smooth except for the occasional ripple caused by the light breeze that stirred the air. The trees along the water's edge were now fully clothed in leaves, their branches reaching toward the sky in a silent display of growth. The world was alive again, and it felt as though everything around her was moving forward, while she stood still, caught in the quiet uncertainty of what to do next. It was the sound of footsteps behind her that pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Alex. She could feel his presence behind her, a quiet comfort that had become as familiar as her own breath. He had been coming to the park with her every morning now, matching her rhythm, matching her pace. It was a silent gesture, but it meant more than she could say. It was his way of showing up, of being there, without the need for words. She felt him come to a stop beside her, standing just a little ways off, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to be a presence she could feel. They stood there for a moment, side by side, in the quiet, watching the pond and the world around them. It was the kind of moment that had become familiar to them both, a moment where words were unnecessary, where the stillness between them was enough to say everything that needed to be said. But as the minutes stretched on, Lillian felt the weight of it, the tension that had settled in the space between them, the quiet pressure that hung in the air. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of their silences, but today, it felt different. There was a sense of anticipation, as though they were both waiting for something to happen, for something to shift, but neither knew how to bring it to the surface. Alex shifted his weight, taking a step closer, his presence warmer now, more tangible. Lillian could feel it in the air between them, the quiet understanding that had always existed, the shared connection that had grown without being named. It was comforting, yes, but it was also uncertain. She could feel that he, too, was aware of the weight of what was growing between them, aware of the silence that had become a shared language, a language that could no longer hold back the truth. She turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster as she did. The soft light of the afternoon filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over everything. The park, once again, had come to life, and the world seemed to be waiting, holding its breath for what might come next. In that moment, Lillian knew that something was shifting between them. It was as though the world was urging them to move forward, to confront the silent truth that had been growing between them. And as much as she had tried to hold back, as much as she had tried to keep her feelings in check, she knew that it was time to face it, time to confront the growing bond that had formed without words, without promises, and without declarations. The air was thick with possibility, with the weight of the unspoken, and Lillian could feel it pressing against her, pushing her towards something unknown. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if Alex felt the same, but she knew that she could no longer stand still. The silence that had once been comfortable had become a space of uncertainty, and she could feel that both of them were on the edge of something that could change everything. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to acknowledge what had been growing in the quiet corners of her heart. The weight of it all, of the unspoken truth, of the connection that had deepened between them, was heavy, but it was also liberating. For once, she wasn't trying to hold it all in, trying to keep it quiet, trying to keep it safe. She was ready to face it, ready to see what would happen next. And so, with the warmth of the afternoon sun on her skin and the soft whisper of the breeze in her hair, she allowed herself to step into the unknown. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to take. And in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it. Ready to face what had been quietly growing between her and Alex, ready to see where it would lead. Chapter 14. The Turning Point. The days had grown warmer, the soft touch of spring settling into the world like a quiet promise. Lillian felt it in the air, in the way the sunlight streamed through the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the park paths. The earth was alive again, each corner of the park blooming with new life. The flowers, once hidden beneath the frost, now stretched their heads toward the sky, their colors bright against the green of the grass. The trees had filled out, their branches heavy with leaves, a canopy of green above her, a shelter from the world. As Lillian walked through the park, the sense of change was all around her. It wasn't just the world around her that was shifting, it was her. The quiet, steady rhythm she had lived with for so long had begun to crack, giving way to something more uncertain, something deeper. The weight of the connection between her and Alex had been growing steadily, the silence between them becoming more loaded, more charged with unspoken understanding. And now, as the days stretched into spring, the unspoken truth between them could no longer be ignored. Lillian had always been someone who valued stability, someone who found comfort in the quiet, the steady, the predictable. But now, as she walked the same path she had walked for months, she realized that she could no longer remain in the quiet, in the space of uncertainty. It was as if the world was pushing her forward, urging her to step into the unknown, to confront the feelings she had been carrying for so long. Alex had become a constant presence in her life. His presence had become as familiar as the rhythm of her steps, as predictable as the changing of the seasons. She had never expected to feel so deeply for someone without the need for words, without the need for grand gestures or declarations. And yet, here she was, her heart caught in a quiet storm, a storm that had been building slowly over time. The clouds now gathering overhead, ready to burst. It was in the small moments, the way his eyes would catch hers when they walked together, the way his presence seemed to calm the restlessness that had begun to grow in her. She had come to rely on those small moments, the unspoken exchange between them, but now she felt something shifting, something that could no longer be held back. She had been walking alone that morning, her steps slow and steady, the park empty save for the occasional jogger or cyclist. She had left the house early, before the world had fully woken up, finding solace in the stillness of the park before the day began. The air was cool against her skin, the earth damp beneath her feet, and for the first time in weeks, she felt as though she could breathe freely, as though she could think clearly. But as she approached the pond, she saw him. Alex, sitting on the same bench by the water's edge, his figure still and calm against the backdrop of the growing light. The sight of him, so familiar, so constant, made something stir inside her. He had always been there, just beyond the edges of her heart, a presence she had come to rely on, to find comfort in. And now, as the distance between them seemed to close, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. A yearning, perhaps, or fear, or both. Lillian stopped at the edge of the pond, her gaze fixed on the water. The pond had changed since their last visit. The surface was now smooth, the water reflecting the soft blue sky above, the ripples from the light breeze barely noticeable. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for the shift that she knew was coming. For a long time, she stood there, watching the water, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. The silence between her and Alex stretched, but it was not the same silence that had been comfortable in the past. This silence was charged, filled with the unspoken things they had both been avoiding. There was an expectation in the air, a sense of tension, as if the very earth beneath her feet was waiting for her to take the next step. It was then that she realized the truth. There was no going back. The space between them had grown too close, the connection too deep. The quiet had been their refuge, a place where they could both exist without the pressure of words, but now it was as though that silence was holding them back, keeping them from moving forward. The path they had been walking together had come to a crossroads, and she knew that something had to change. As Lillian turned to face Alex, she could see that he had been watching her, his eyes steady and patient, as though he had known this moment was coming. There was a softness in his expression, an understanding that she hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't allowed herself to see. He was standing now, his posture relaxed, his gaze never leaving her, and it was in that moment, that unspoken exchange, that something shifted between them. She felt the weight of it, the quiet pressure that had been building, the pull of the connection that had become too strong to ignore. It was as though the world had tilted slightly, and for the first time, Lillian allowed herself to acknowledge what had been growing between them, what they had been building, without words, without plans. It was simple, but it was real. It was a quiet, steady thing that had crept into their lives and had become something undeniable. For the first time, Lillian allowed herself to admit the truth. She was ready to face whatever came next. She had been holding back, afraid of what acknowledging this connection might mean, afraid of the unknown. But now she knew that she couldn't keep living in the shadows of what could be. It was time to step into the light. She took a step toward him, her heart beating faster now, the ground beneath her feet solid but soft. The distance between them closed, and as she approached him, Alex's gaze softened even further. There was a quiet understanding in the way he looked at her, a recognition of the moment they were both standing in. It was as if he had been waiting for this, waiting for her to come to this point. And now that she had, there was no need for words, no need for anything other than the silent acknowledgement of what had already begun. They stood there, in the quiet of the park, side by side, feeling the shift between them. It was as though the air around them had changed, had become charged with the understanding that something had changed, that this was the turning point. There was no need for declarations, no need for promises. The connection was already there, woven between them in the spaces where words had never been needed. And yet, in that moment, everything felt more real, more tangible than it had ever been before. The world around them had grown brighter, the sunlight now streaming through the leaves, casting a warm glow over everything. The park was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves, and in that moment, it felt as though everything was moving forward. Everything was shifting, even the earth itself. As the silence stretched on, Lillian realized that the weight she had been carrying for so long was finally starting to lift. The uncertainty that had been hanging over her, the fear of the unknown, was being replaced by something else. Something lighter, something that felt like hope. She didn't know what would come next, didn't know how their relationship would change, but for the first time in months, she was no longer afraid of the future. She was ready to face it. And as they stood there, side by side, in the quiet of the park, they both understood, without words, that they were no longer standing on the edge of something. They were stepping into it. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was a path they would walk together. And in that understanding, Lillian felt the weight of change, but also the lightness of what was to come. Chapter 15. The Dawn of Tomorrow. The days had become warmer, the promise of summer lingering in the air as the world continued to shift around them. The park had transformed yet again, its vibrant colors deepening, the flowers in full bloom, and the trees heavy with green. The once muted earth, still shaking off the last remnants of winter, had fully embraced spring, and now everything seemed alive, buzzing with energy, as if the world itself was waking up. Lillian found herself walking through the park every morning, her steps steady, but her heart lighter than it had been in months. The path that she had once walked alone now seemed to stretch ahead with a new purpose. Alex walked beside her, though the pace of their steps was measured and calm. There was no rush, no urgency. Just the quiet understanding that they were moving forward, not away from something, but towards something unknown and exciting. In the weeks since that day by the pond, when everything had shifted between them, Lillian had felt the weight of uncertainty lift. She had let go of the hesitations that had once held her back, the fears of what could go wrong, and the worry of whether this quiet connection was enough. It was more than enough. It was real. It was something she hadn't allowed herself to fully accept until now. The bond that had been growing in the silence between them had become stronger with each passing day, and she could feel the unspoken truth in the air around them. The truth that they were no longer simply two people walking side by side but were, in some quiet way, building something together. She noticed how Alex had changed, too. There was a softness in his demeanor, a warmth in the way he looked at her, an openness she hadn't seen before. He no longer held back, no longer let the silences between them feel like a barrier. Instead, those moments of stillness had become a space of connection, a way for them to communicate beyond words. In his presence, she felt seen, understood, and cared for in a way that went beyond the need for explanations or grand gestures. And as they walked through the park each day, the quiet became something they both seemed to cherish, something that no longer needed to be filled with unnecessary words. It was a comfortable silence, a silence that said more than any sentence could. Lillian had come to find peace in it, a kind of clarity she hadn't known before. She didn't need to question it anymore, didn't need to worry about where it would lead. The answer was in the way they walked together, in the way their steps fell in sync, in the way their hands brushed when they stood close. Their relationship had become something beautiful and simple, rooted in the stillness of shared moments, in the unspoken bond that had formed between them. There were no promises, no expectations, no need for declarations. Everything they needed was already there, woven into the fabric of their connection, and Lillian knew, deep down, that this was something real, something that didn't need to be rushed or forced. It was unfolding naturally, just as it should. But even as she felt a growing sense of certainty in her heart, there was still a part of her that carried the weight of the past. The fear that had once held her back wasn't entirely gone. It was still there, lingering at the edges of her mind. A quiet reminder that things could change, that life was unpredictable. But she had learned to carry that fear with her, to accept it as part of the journey. After all, she knew now that there was no way to predict the future, no way to control what would come. All she could do was take each step forward, trusting that wherever the path led, she would face it with an open heart. Alex seemed to sense this about her. He never pushed, never rushed. He simply let things unfold as they would, giving her space when she needed it, but always staying close, always there when she turned to him. His steady presence had become a source of calm in her life, and she had come to rely on it more than she had expected. The uncertainty of their future no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a possibility, a gift. They had no need to define it, to put labels on what they had. It was simply enough. One afternoon, as they sat on the bench by the pond, the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the water. The park was more alive than ever. Families walking hand in hand, children chasing each other through the grass, and couples walking together in quiet conversation. But for Lillian and Alex, the world seemed to slow down when they were together, as if nothing else mattered except the peace they found in each other's presence. They had begun to meet here more frequently, as though this spot had become their shared sanctuary, a place where they could simply be, without the need for conversation or explanation. They didn't need to talk about what they felt. It was already known, and in the silence, they found comfort. It was as if the world had given them this space to simply exist, to let things grow naturally, without pressure, without hurry. Lillian looked out at the water, watching the soft ripples as they moved across the surface, disturbed only by the occasional fish breaking through, or a breeze that stirred the air. She thought about how much she had changed over the past few months, how much she had learned about herself and about what it meant to open her heart to another person. She had spent so much time holding back, keeping her feelings carefully guarded, afraid of the vulnerability that came with letting someone in. But now, she felt that vulnerability was not a weakness, it was a strength. It was what had allowed her to truly connect with Alex, to build something real between them. As the day began to fade, the light softening into shades of pink and gold, Lillian felt a quiet contentment settle over her. They didn't need to talk. They didn't need to ask questions or make promises. They simply needed to be. And in that moment, she knew that this was what she had been searching for all along. A love that didn't demand anything, that wasn't built on expectations, but on the quiet, steady presence of two people who had found each other in the midst of life's uncertainties. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the park, the sky a blend of warm colors that seemed to mirror the peace she felt inside. The air was cool, but the warmth of the day still lingered, and Lillian could feel the quiet pulse of life all around her. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the dawn of tomorrow. And as they sat there, side by side, watching the day turn into night, Lillian knew that this was just the beginning. The future was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but she was no longer afraid of what might come. Whatever tomorrow held, she was ready to face it. Because now, she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. She had found something real, something steady in Alex, and that was enough. The quiet was their answer, the silence between them the promise of a shared journey. A journey that didn't need words to define it, but simply the presence of two hearts moving forward together, in step with the world, in step with each other. As the sky darkened, and the first stars began to appear, Lillian felt the weight of the day fall away. She leaned her head against Alex's shoulder, feeling the warmth of him beside her, and she closed her eyes, letting the moment settle around her. The future was waiting, but for now, in this quiet, simple moment, she knew everything was as it should be. And with that thought, she allowed herself to let go, to rest in the peace of the present, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.